French king. All right, so in 1756, there was a big war in Europe known as the 7 Years' War, in which all of the major countries fought against each other. And as part of this, the Europeans also went to war against each other in North America, which led to a distinct colonial war that the British called the French and Indian War. On September 8, 1760, the British invaded Montreal, the capital of New France, and the French governor, the Marquis of Vaudreuil, surrendered and fled back to France. At this point, the official list considers the Continental Commander of the British Armed Forces, a guy called Lord Amherst, who was actually based in New York, to be in control. And Canada has been under the British Crown ever since. In 1763, the British formally turned occupied New France into a new British colony, first known as Quebec, and by the late 18th century as Canada. It was run by an administrator appointed by England, known as the Governor General of British North America. The first was James Murray, followed by some other men that Canadians might have heard of, including Carleton, Dalhousie, and Sherbrooke. The Governor Generalship still exists to this day, and is actually the longest continuously operating office in the Canadian government, but more on this in a sec. As the years went on, Canada's population swelled due to an influx of new British settlers, and then after 1776, loyalist refugees from the American Revolution. And as the colony grew larger and more prosperous, there were increasing demands for an end of direct rule by governors and something closer to democracy. So in 1841, reforms were made to bring proper parliamentary government to Canada for the first time. What was now known as the Province of Canada got a single elected parliament, replacing weak local assemblies, and it was agreed that the Governor General would appoint a civilian cabinet from that parliament to help him run the colony. In a very broad sense, this is the same system of government that Canada has today, so a lot of historians will say that the 1840s were when Canada became a democracy. But on the other hand, the system wasn't exactly like it is today, because the Governor General was still nominally in charge, and there was no prime minister. In fact, the question of who exactly was running Canada's new elected governments during this time is kind of a muddled issue different historians have different takes on. In theory, the highest ranking politician in the elected government was the president of the cabinet, but this was a mostly symbolic chairman type position and not very powerful. It was, however, often held by some of the most important Canadian politicians of the time, like Thomas D'Arcy McGee and George Brown, who we now regard as early leaders of Canada. But true power was held by the heads of the biggest English and French factions of the Parliament, which were sort of like early Canadian political parties. See, in those days, there was a lot of tension between French Canadians and English Canadians, if you can imagine such a thing. And this caused a lot of issues because the English and French parts of Canada controlled an equal number of seats in the Parliament. So in order to form a workable majority and get things passed, there would have to be some sort of alliance between the French and English political leaders. And this is how the cabinets of that time are usually discussed. There would be some sort of powerful English-Canadian political leader, and he would form an alliance with a powerful French-Canadian political leader, and they would divvy up the cabinet jobs amongst their people in order to provide Canada with a stable government. And by stable, we mean like able to survive 1 year without completely collapsing into squabbles and infighting. The first fully democratically elected cabinet, which held office from 1848 to 1851, was dominated by an English-Canadian faction loyal to a guy called Robert Baldwin, and a French-Canadian faction led by a guy called Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine. They're considered these major figures in the history of Canadian democracy, and there's a big monument to them at the Canadian Parliament and everything. The two major power brokers in Parliament would often change after an election, or just after the breakdown of a coalition, and Canadian historians usually identify the cabinets of this period by the names of the French and English political leaders who were the most powerful at the time. So first was the Baldwin-Lafontaine administration, followed by the Hincks-Morin administration, and then the McNabb-Morin administration. As the years went on, people of the time would sometimes even start referring to these two leading guys as the prime ministers. But that said, it is important to understand that in those days, people understood the whole concept of prime minister differently than we do now. It was used more literally in the sense that the cabinet had a bunch of ministers, and the most important people were the prime ministers. Anyway, based on the tenures of the cabinet presidents, we can say that there were 18 different administrations during the 26-year period between 1841 and 1867. So yeah, not the most politically stable time. It was partially for that reason that in 1867, the entire Canadian political system was dramatically revised again. The province of Canada was reorganized into a new self-governing colony called the Dominion of Canada, with expanded borders. Two other British North American colonies that existed at that time, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, were merged into it, and a new system of provincial governments based on the state governments of the United States was introduced. This included a new local government for the French-Canadian part of Canada, which became known as the Province of Quebec, which I mention only because it's important to understand that as something different from the Colony of Quebec, which was once the name for all of Canada. Anyway, parliamentary democracy at the national level continued, with the Governor-General continuing to appoint a cabinet from the Parliament, but the system was also becoming a lot more clearly hierarchical. The leading English-Canadian politician of the time was a guy called John A. Macdonald, who had played a large role in setting up the new constitutional system. And in the first election to the new Dominion Parliament, his conservative faction, which was now operating more like a modern political party, won a big landslide victory. And Macdonald accordingly got to fill the cabinet with all of his people, as was now standard practice. Macdonald actually did have a French-Canadian coalition partner, a guy called Georges-Étienne Cartier. But the new parliament didn't have the same 50-50 seat split between French and English areas anymore, and Macdonald was such a domineering and even authoritarian personality that people stopped thinking of co-prime ministers after him. As a result, today we celebrate John A. Macdonald as being the first true prime minister of Canada, with all of the other prime ministers up until Justin Trudeau existing in an unbroken chain after him. But again, it would be a while before the idea of a prime minister, as we think of it today, really became formal. Macdonald's official cabinet position was Attorney General, which was one of the most important jobs in the old system and the one that Macdonald liked best. But then in 1873, Macdonald resigned, and the head of the Liberal faction in the Parliament, a guy called Alexander Mackenzie, was put in charge of the cabinet. Today we recognize him as the second prime minister, but his official title was Minister of Public Works. And that's how it worked for many decades. The prime minister of the cabinet was the head of the largest party in the parliament, but he could hold any number of different cabinet jobs. You know, he could be the Minister of Finance, or Minister of Railroads, or Foreign Minister, or whatever else he wanted. This setup ended in 1957, when a guy named Louis Saint Laurent became the first man to be sworn in as Prime Minister of Canada, and no other position, which was just an official recognition of something that had long since become clear. The prime ministership was a very important job in its own right, and indeed the undisputed top job in the Canadian government. A few years before that, however, something else very important happened in the Canadian political system. In 1952, Britain stopped appointing people to serve as Governor General of Canada. This was something they had done for nearly 200 straight years since the conquest of New France in 1760. The position of Governor General remained, and remains to this day, but would henceforth be filled with Canadians and become a ceremonial rather than colonial position. Let me see if I can name all of the Governor Generals since 1952. The first Canadian was Vincent Massey, and he was followed by Georges Vanier, and then Roland Michener, and then Jules Legare, and then Edward Schreyer, and then Jean Sauvé, and then Raymond Hanatchison, and then Romeo LeBlanc, then Adrian Clarkson, Michel Jean, David Johnston, and today we have Julie Payette. All right, and now let's go back and name all of the prime ministers of Canada since 1867. John A. Macdonald served until 1873, like I said. Then he was replaced by Alexander Mackenzie. But then Macdonald got back in 1878, and he served until he died. He was then replaced by four men in quick succession: John Abbott, John Thompson, Mackenzie Bowell, and Charles Tupper. Tupper was replaced by then Wilfrid Laurier, who was replaced by Robert Borden, then Arthur Mann, Mackenzie King, Arthur Mann again, Mackenzie King again, R.B. Bennett, Mackenzie King a third time, Louis Saint Laurent, who, like I said, was the first guy to be inaugurated as Prime Minister as a distinct office. Then John Diefenbaker, Lester Pearson, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Joe Clark, Pierre Elliott Trudeau again, John Turner, Brian Mulroney, Kim Campbell, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, Stephen Harper, and good old Justin Trudeau today. And thus we reach the end of Canadian history. But if you want to keep the learning going, why not check out today's video sponsor, The Great Courses Plus.